This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. If you've been listening to the show for a while, you've probably heard me mention I was raised in Pennsylvania. My husband, too. After the power outages in Connecticut last August, I remember talking to him about the number of outages we've dealt with since moving to this state in 2006. Neither of us could remember dealing with long-term power outages when we were growing up. Certainly, extreme weather has become more common since we were kids. Scientists warn these weather events will only continue. Now, beyond worrying about our power grid infrastructure, how confident should we be as consumers in how our utility companies prepare and respond to these storms? Today, Where We Live, we hear directly from the head of Connecticut's utility regulator. PURA investigated Eversource and United Illuminating for their response to last August's outages after Tropical Storm Isaias. We'll be hearing from Chairman Marissa Gillett in just a little bit. If you have a question for her, here's the number, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Joining us first on Zoom is Patrick Skahill. He's a reporter for Connecticut Public Radio covering science and the environment. Patrick, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Lucy. Good to be here.
So this hour, we're going to be talking about Eversource and United Illuminating. And we just wanted to note for our listeners, Eversource's Executive Vice President and General Counsel, Greg Butler, is also the chairman of the Board of Trustees of Connecticut Public. So, Patrick, take us back to August when so many of us were without power. This was around the time Tropical Storm. Yeah, right. Do we really want to remember that time when Tropical Storm Isaias first appeared and really kind of was quite a whopper? I want you to talk about the impact of that storm and what happened, particularly in our state.
Sure. So Tropical Storm Isaias hit in early August of 2020. This obviously was during the summer of the pandemic that's been going on here for over a year. This came at a time when a lot of people were at home more, were working from home more, were paying attention to their electric bill more. And it came at a time when a lot of consumers were already angry with Eversource for the bills that they were getting in the mail. People were saying they were too high. And then the storm comes, knocks out power. There's a house on my street, Lucy. To this day, there's still a blue tarp on the roof. Hundreds of thousands of people lost power, homes were damaged, and it took some people upwards of a week to get their power back. So after that happened, obviously there was a lot of blowback from customers, from legislators, from local leaders, against the utilities, not only for their response to the storm, but also for the preparation to the storm. So PURA, the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, who you're going to be speaking to later, opened up an investigation into this, and that went on for the next several months.
I wanted to talk about some of the conversations that were happening before this storm hit, because I think that was part of the issue is how the electric companies were thinking about, was this going to be a bad storm for our area, Patrick?
Right. And storm preparation is always a bit of a science and a bit of an art. There's a lot utilities need to do in advance of a storm coming to an area, and that includes pre-staging crews. It includes monitoring meteorological forecasts to see where this storm is going to come from. And Isaias, Lucy, and I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about this, was a tricky one. This was a storm, it originated in Puerto Rico. Essentially, the entire eastern seaboard was in this cone where this storm could potentially hit. And that made it difficult, Eversource said after the fact, to pre-stage crews because utilities work off of something called mutual aid in advance of a storm, where utilities in other states would lend their resources to an area that was hit by an emergency. But with Isaias, the whole eastern seaboard was locked down. Those utilities, in Eversource's accounting of it, didn't want to come up because they thought, well, we might have to deal with our own problem. So that left Eversource in a position, and this was sort of testimony that they gave to PURA in the ensuing months, where they had to bring in these resources from the Midwest and the West, which costs money, which takes time. And again, it's just really tricky sometimes to predict these storms. And when Isaias hit, I don't think anyone anticipated that it was going to have the impact that it did.
Yeah, I put out a tweet that I had lost to power for 5 days, and we actually gave in finally, Patrick, and bought a generator. And that was an experience of a lot of people. 5, 6 days. There were some cases people were out of power for more than a week. United Illuminating, how did their response or preparation actually to the storm, how is that a little bit different than Eversource?
Yeah, so I think what I might do is I'll fast forward to what happened yesterday, which was the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. Again, we had mentioned they had been investigating how both utilities, United Illuminating and Eversource, responded to the storm, but also prepared for the storm. And what PURA announced yesterday was that Eversource, both utilities failed in some respects. Eversource failed a lot worse, was basically what PURA says, and they can put a more bureaucratic, smart twist on it later. But that was my basic takeaway. United Illuminating messed a few things up, particularly in terms of some of their emergency reporting, and I'm sure PURA will get into this more later. But the main takeaway was that Eversource did a poorer job preparing for the storm and responding to it. And the decision that was released yesterday, which we can go through, reflects that.
I was struck by a quote from one of the PURA regulators and Mr. Karen, who said in your story that even the way that the company Eversource communicated with stakeholders, that there was a lot of people didn't know what was going on in real time. And can you remind us how even town leaders, this is not the first bad storm to hit our state, but just the lack of communication that was so frustrating, not only for customers, but for town leaders trying to respond to their particular emergencies happening?
Yeah, sure. So in the decision that PURA released yesterday, there were several directives that PURA was giving to Eversource and UI. Among those directives was improve emergency response plans. And PURA was ordering the utilities to increase their line workers, their damage assessors, and other emergency response and restoration resources. Included in that is something called liaisons. And this was, to your point, Lucy, a major hang-up with a lot of community leaders in Connecticut. These liaisons are, when it works right, supposed to be providing these town leaders with actionable information about outages, when crews are going to be coming in, when they're going to be fixing stuff, so town leaders can then take that information to people like you who are out of power for 5 days and let you know okay, here's what the plan is. That system broke down. Eversource has said, we're going to try to do better on this. And this was a main issue for Michael Karen yesterday, one of the PURA members, but also just for many town leaders across Connecticut.
Mm. Can you talk more about the role when these bad storms happen and residents are angry and they've got reason to be, right? And they see that we pay some of the highest electric costs in the nation, but at the same time, when you have a regulator looking into the response of companies and how they have to balance, their purview in handling and working with these utilities, but also they're hearing from so many residents who are upset and who want to see action. But is that entirely what PURA needs to respond to?
Sure. Well, that's a question that I can leave for Marissa Gillett, the PURA chair, who's coming on in a few minutes. But I can say what they did yesterday. And there were two kind of really big things, big actions that PURA took against both Eversource and United Illuminating. One, and I apologize in advance for the wonk speak I'm about to say, but I'll try to explain it better. So PURA is reducing return on equity for Eversource and United Illuminating. So, okay, what's return on equity? Basically allowable profits. So this is essentially reducing the allowable profits that both of these utilities can take from ratepayers here in Connecticut. PURA is structuring this right now as an indefinite penalty. Eversource did, I believe, have a prior reduction imposed after the 2011 and 2012 storms. But Marissa Gillett, the PURA chair, was saying yesterday, apparently that was insufficient. Didn't ensure adequate storm performance, as evidenced by what happened. So for Eversource, the penalty is 0.9%. For UI, it's 0.15%. And yesterday, PURA was hesitant to put a dollar figure on what that will mean for the company's going forward. They did comment on the financial impact that this would have in the context of 2020 numbers. So if you use that as a proxy, PURA was saying yesterday this would equate to about $25 million a year for Eversource and about $1.3 million a year for United Illuminating. PURA is saying this isn't a penalty. Again, this is a return on equity going forward. So it's an incentive for the utilities essentially to do better, to perform better. So maybe that rate gets adjusted in the future. But PURA is potentially pursuing penalties. They've reopened a docket to do that, which could issue civil penalties, and those could have monetary fines attached as well.
And I'm sure our residents will be interested to hear more from Marissa Gillett about some of the consequences after this many-month investigation into the preparation response to the power outages that many of us saw last August. Patrick Skahill, reporter for Connecticut Public Radio, thank you for coming on to just remind us what we were all dealing with back then and the fact that there's some broad strokes in this report. We're going to dig more into that with Marissa Gillett after the break. Patrick, thank you.
Thank you.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Again, the chairman of PURA, that is Marissa Gillett, will be here to answer your questions and talk more about this final decision, what it all means. You can join us with your question to 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WMPR. Or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Plenty of residents were angry with electric company Eversource last August after power outages persisted for days in a pandemic. Liz on Twitter shared with us, I was out of power for 5 days, fridge of spoiled food, all while trying to continue working during a pandemic. I live in an apartment building, so I did not buy a generator, and my landlord could never be bothered. Again, that's Liz tweeting at us about what she experienced after the outages from Tropical Storm Isaias. Something else also gets people's blood boiling. It's when utilities talk about rate hikes that are needed to pay for storm response, or that they hope to recoup some of that from customers. Then CEO of Eversource telling during a conference call with analysts, James Judge, again, he's no longer the CEO, predicted that PURA, the state regulatory authority, will ultimately rule that Eversource can recoup some of the $228 million it spent restoring power in Connecticut. Now, state regulators have power over electric rates. They can even compel utilities to pay a fine based on poor performance. Connecticut Public Utility Regulatory Authority, known as PURA, investigated Eversource and United Illuminating. It has issued a final decision. To talk about it, joining us now on Zoom is Marissa Gillett, chairman of Connecticut's Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, or PURA. Marissa, welcome back to the show.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Our listeners can join as well, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So I asked this question to Patrick, but it's probably better suited for you, Marissa, to talk about your relationship, PURA's relationship with utilities like Eversource and UI, and the regulatory aspect of your role.
Absolutely. So every state across the country has their own version of PURA. They're frequently called public service commissions or regulatory commissions. Our function is to serve as the economic regulator and try to facilitate, to step in where you have a monopoly that is not subject to free market forces, and try to create those simulate those forces, if you will. So our relationship, you can think of us a little bit like a judge. So PURA is a quasi-judicial agency, which means we can issue legally binding orders. So the utilities are one stakeholder that come before us. And then there are other stakeholders, like there's a statutory party that represents all consumers across the state called the Consumer Council. Mm-hmm. And what happens is all these parties come to us in the context of a proceeding, which is just a case, and they put on a case, they present us evidence, and we have to make a finding. So, I think one of the common misconceptions is that PURA is an advocate. Unfortunately, we're not. We are statutorily charged with balancing the interests between the shareholders of the utilities and the ratepayers of the state. Now, we can talk about whether my perspective is historically that balance between the ratepayers and the shareholders, perhaps that balance, not perhaps, I'm going to say, I don't think that balance has been maintained in this state from my perspective, coming into Connecticut just 2 years ago. But our relationship with the utilities is their regulator. And I'm not sure that there's been a recognition on their part that we're their regulator, not their collaborator.
Thank you for clarifying that. Because you mentioned the monopolies, John asked, why does PURA continue to allow these monopolies? There's no competition and the prices keep going up with no relief in sight. The customer ends up paying for the utility company screw-ups, as John mentions. How do you respond to that, Marissa?
It's a great question. So the structure of regulatory commissions and utilities was invented about 100 years ago, more than that at this point, in the recognition that you couldn't have competing electric grids. Electric grids are just too costly to have two of. So you have a monopoly electric distribution company. Customers can select, they do have choice in terms of who's providing their supply. Happy to talk about that a little bit. But it's really a function of practicality that you have a monopoly. And that is, pursuant to state law as well. So what we can look at and, will presumably looking forward is, whether Eversource is the appropriate franchise, owner for that system. You saw Senator Blumenthal raise that question, following the storms last August. And there's a bill in the legislature right now that has a task force looking in on the issue. But fundamentally, electric distribution companies are designed to be a monopoly because having two competing systems would just be too costly.
So let's dig into this report, this final decision that was issued by PURA. I understood it took 8 months to create this report. So I imagine you heard from a lot of people. So talk through how you took their input into your assessment of the performance of Eversource and United Illuminating.
So one thing that I've been trying to talk to people about since I started at PURA 2 years ago is the importance of the public voice in the PURA proceedings. Because as we touched on at the top of the interview, if the only voices in my courtroom, which is a virtual courtroom right now, are the utilities, then it's very difficult for me to strike a balanced decision because I have to make a decision on the evidence that's put into the record. So we heard from a lot of consumers. In fact, we received over 500 comments into our docket. Also, we were fortunate to have the participation of a number of municipalities as formal interveners into the proceeding, which was crucial to provide evidence, direct evidence on those elected officials' experience during and after the storm. So their input, as well as the input of customers, is reflected throughout the decision and used as evidence as to why both Eversource and to some degree UI failed the performance standards that they were obligated to uphold, pursuant to authority order in the law.
So let's talk specifically about Eversource. Taking in all that input that you and your fellow peers within PURA looked at in terms of preparation, response, communication. Tell us how Eversource did.
Ultimately, PURA concluded that Eversource failed in almost every respect. Every performance standard that we looked at that had been codified and publicized in advance of the storm, Eversource had a deficiency, if not an outright failure. So that included, as Patrick was talking to you about, they had multiple failures in their communication structure, not just the way they communicated to customers or officials, but actually their communications infrastructure failed as well. And there were rippling effects from that. They also failed to adequately pre-stage resources And Patrick talked a little bit about that as well in mutual aid. I think one additional thing to say there is their failure to, pre-stage resources had devastating consequences throughout the rest of the storm. The first 48 hours after the storm are the most important in terms of public safety. And they simply didn't have enough boots on the ground or physically located in Connecticut to even assess the damage at that point. So I think it was just a widespread, pervasive failure on their part, and the consequences for them are going to be steep.
Mm. And when we talk about the consequences, Patrick mentioned this penalty. So can you describe that to us more about how this is going to impact Eversource and United Illuminating?
Sure. So the return on equity penalty, apologies, I'm referring to it as an incentive for opportunity for them to do better. A return on equity is simulated in the monopoly environment by the regulators. It really speaks to the profitability of the utility. So by imposing a reduction, so right now Eversource has an authorized ROE of 9.25%. We've imposed a 90 basis point reduction. So they take 9.25 minus 0.9%. And that equates to the authorized amount of, profit that they can collect from ratepayers. So as Patrick talked about, we've estimated that if we use 2020 numbers, this would come to the amount of $25 million per year. And that's money that is not collected from ratepayers. So we will go through, we're in a parallel proceeding right now where we're investigating interim rate decreases for both Eversource and UI. That's pursuant to the Take Back Our Grid legislation from the fall. So we will look to incorporate the ROE reductions for both Eversource and UI in that proceeding.
Eversource did give us a statement, as well as other media. They say we stand by a response in Storm Isaias. As we know, our thousands of employees showed skill and dedication in restoring power to customers as quickly as possible. Also, there are many areas for improvement that we're already addressing, and we continue to work in good faith with our communities, customers, and regulators to improve our performance. And so can you describe the process moving forward? Then we can talk more about United Illuminating, but Eversource, can they appeal this ruling, and how quickly will all of this be worked out, Marissa?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I've seen their statement as well. It's comparable to the statement they've released at every step of the way, and really reflects to me a continued tone deafness on their part. The issue was not with their workers. When we made, a special note in our decision and in our statements yesterday that the workers that, belong to Eversource and UI, as well as the ones that came from out of state, they performed admirably. They got the power back up as soon as possible. This is not a reflection on them. This is a reflection on the management of Eversource and UI to a lesser degree. And, I'm very extremely disappointed that they're still not revisiting, their tone and their takeaways from our decision. So they have the legal right to appeal our findings. As, I talked about PURA as a quasi-judicial agency. So the legal opinion that we put out can be appealed to Superior Court. My colleagues and I, in the decision yesterday, said that we hope they don't appeal, because I think that would show, that they both are taking accountability for the findings that we've issued. But given the amount of money at stake, I imagine that they will appeal. They appealed a $10,000 fine I issued last year, so I can't imagine that they're not going to issue or appeal a $25 million one. So the schedule for, a Superior Court review, that's set by the Connecticut Superior Court. And I really couldn't speak to how long that would take. But in the meantime, PURA will continue moving forward on the basis of the decision that we issued yesterday, because we considered a lot of comprehensive evidence and think that we've reached the right decision.
You're hearing Marissa Gillett here on Where We Live, chairman of Connecticut's Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. Again, as we're talking about the report, the investigation that they did over the last 8 months, issuing a final decision, highly critical of how utility Eversource responded after that tropical storm last August. If you have a question, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can share a comment on our Facebook page or find us on Twitter at Where We Live. So we talked about that return dealing with their profit. And so what about fines for deficiencies in the last storm? Marissa, how will that pan out?
A great question. As we talked about, the return on equity reductions are an incentive for them to do better in future storms. But of course, our decision yesterday spoke to the multitude of deficiencies that we saw last August. And with that comes penalties for their failures. And state law prescribes the amount of penalties that we can assess. It's a percentage of their annual distribution revenues. So we will be issuing that preliminary notice of violation late next week, in which we list the areas of noncompliance and how that translates into a dollar figure. So those fines and penalties, we have a couple of options what to do with them. They can be used to offset needed investments in the system. They can be returned to ratepayers as a credit. So we will be talking with our stakeholders about. I'm sure the other parties have opinions about how those fines should be translated into, and that will come out. That process will start next week.
I think residents who are customers of Eversource United Illuminating, they'll be glad to hear that there will be some consequences on these utilities. But then we all wonder about how this will then impact our bills in the future. And so when I read that quote from then CEO of Eversource talking about even being able to recoup the amount of money they've spent on after Tropical Storm Isaias, what can you tell our listeners about their fears that they'll just see the costs of what utilities are paying out in our bills in the future?
I also read that report, which I found, Mr. Judge's quote to be deeply offensive, of course, as a ratepayer myself, but also as their regulator. He refused to even come to our evidentiary hearings. He sent, deputies. So, and they also have been dragging their feet throughout the process on even turning over that preliminary cost data. So to hear him address investors in a way that he refused to address me was, just deeply offensive. I think indicative of their opinion of whether they, need to be held accountable by us. So they did not seek cost recovery through this proceeding. So there was nothing for us to approve or deny. We did, however, reach findings in the decision. They're called prudency determinations. So, just to take a very quick tangent, I think what people get frustrated about with utility rate making is it's bound by these two U.S. Supreme Court precedents that allow utilities to recover their prudently incurred investments. And as well as a reasonable return on those investments. So what the real issue here is the money that was spent by one or both of the utilities preparing for and responding to the storm, was that prudently incurred? Was it reasonable? And if it was prudent and reasonable, then they have a legal right to recover it. But what you saw in the final decision yesterday was that we made a number of determinations that certain areas of their response were very imprudent. So when they do come in to apply for a cost recovery, and unfortunately we cannot prevent them from that application, but when they do seek cost recovery, we'll be looking to the determinations from yesterday's decision, and they'll have to they'll be faced with those findings of imprudence.
Again, you can join our conversation if you have a question for the chairman of PURA, Marissa Gillett, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. We've been focusing a lot on Eversource, your final decision after this investigation, also focusing on United Illuminating, not as critical of that utility, but tell us where they needed to improve.
Yeah, we did. As you mentioned, we were less critical of UI, but one thing struck me at the beginning of the investigation, and I think it was a quote that came out of a letter from Congressman Joe Courtney to me, if I'm remembering correctly, and he was encouraging PURA not to view UI and Eversource as the measuring sticks against each other, but rather, we have municipalities and co-ops in the state that performed admirably following the storm, and that maybe they should be the measuring stick. And I thought that was a really interesting perspective. And so what we were careful to do through yesterday's decision was, it's hard not to compare UI and Eversource against each other, particularly when you're writing about them in the same decision. But we were very careful to say, UI may have done better than Eversource. They did much better than Eversource, but they still had shortcomings. And some of those shortcomings were particularly noticeable in their interactions with the city of Bridgeport and their failure to satisfy all of their what are called make safe obligations in that community. They also had a number of issues with taking the highest priority calls for life safety events following the immediate aftermath of the tropical storm. So they were much better, still had some issues, and that's why we also announced an ROE reduction for them as well, just to a lesser degree than Eversource, to reflect the difference in their performance.
And we did get a statement also from United Illuminating, spokesperson Ed Crowder writing in part, "We have PURA's final decision. We're still reviewing it. However, we're disappointed the ruling does not fully reflect the facts we presented during the proceeding, and that it imposes a penalty despite PURA's finding that UI, quote, generally met the standards of acceptable performance and conducted itself prudently and efficiently." Marissa, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I think what he left out of that quote was a very important phrase from our decision, which was subject to the exceptions that are noted in that decision. And those exceptions are what drove the consequences that you saw yesterday. So, I appreciate the way that UI approached this investigation. I think there was a marked difference between both companies in terms of their cooperation, and their tone and their willingness to take accountability. So I do commend UI's management for, from my perspective, a good faith participation in the investigation. Nonetheless, regulation and holding people accountable, it's uncomfortable. It can be uncomfortable. I don't shy away from it, obviously, from yesterday's decision. And I encourage UI to embrace the findings from yesterday and improve on the deficiencies that we did find.
You're hearing Marissa Gillett here on Where We Live, chairman of Connecticut's Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, also known as PURA. We've been talking about a final decision by PURA after its investigation into how electric companies responded to last August's power outages after Tropical Storm Isaias. Now, PURA's final decision was not only highly critical of Eversource, but it will impact how much profit the company can make from Connecticut ratepayers going forward. We're going to continue talking to Marissa after the break. And if you have a question about PURA or this final decision, question about the system process moving forward, you can join us as well. 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest on Zoom, Marissa Gillett, Chairman of Connecticut's Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, also known as PURA. If you have a question for Marissa, 888-720-9677. Chris is calling in from Wethersfield with a question. Chris, go ahead.
Yes. Marissa, something seems to have changed in a positive direction since you have come on board. And I just needed to have a definition. I'm looking at an ancient, probably mission statement that you had. You know, PURA is statutorily charged with regulating the rates and services of Connecticut investors-owned electricity, natural gas, water, and telecommunication companies, and is the franchising authority for the state's cable TV companies. I'm interested in, what do you consider telecom in our state?
Marissa?
Great question. I really appreciate the feedback. I hope that, ratepayers have seen a change. Monday marked my 2-year anniversary in this role after the governor recruited me from Maryland, and I hope to make some continued changes for the duration of my term. The telecommunications portion of our regulation has been interesting for me. Connecticut deregulated the telecom sector about 20 years ago, is my understanding. So PURA's regulation in that space is quite limited by law. Right now, our main activities are with respect to the siting of, so SITING, of small cell antennas. We also have some regulatory authority over a small portion of Frontier. So we regulate their what's called POT service, plain old telephone service. And there's a bill pending in the legislature this session. Governor Ned Lamont has asked the legislature to consider empowering PURA to regulate broadband. So that legislation is under consideration, by the legislature right now. And if that's adopted, PURA's regulatory authority in the telecom space would, go from 0 to 100 overnight. So, stay tuned. We are a creature of statute. So if the governor and the legislature would like me to take on, the regulation of broadband, I think my colleagues and I stand ready. We're just waiting for that direction.
We heard from Bill on Twitter, who wrote, shouldn't PURA require better prep, tree pruning, underground feeders, network redundancy, distributed storage? Let's talk about that, Marissa, this concern that how to make our grid more reliable and other ways to do it.
I would love to talk about that, because that's what the governor brought me to the state to do. It's, generally considered under the umbrella of what's called grid modernization. So that's what I came to the state to do. And what I found, instead was that I, had to spend 8 months investigating their failures. We have been moving my grid mod dockets forward at the same time. They just don't generate, as much interest, I'd say. But we absolutely need to be focused on things like decentralizing our grid through energy storage and other, distributed energy resources. Undergrounding, especially strategic undergrounding of portions of the circuits, that needs to be on the table. What I've heard consistently from our utilities in a couple of different dockets over the past years, they consistently throw out how expensive undergrounding is. And, I think that's misleading. Tree management, it's called vegetation management, that is expensive. And it has to be done on, cycles. It's not a one and done. And when you have an increasing number of catastrophic storms where you're having to rebuild your system multiple times a year, the cost of undergrounding a portion of your circuit begins to look a lot more attractive. So, we have a proceeding, it's called the Equitable Modern Grid proceeding. There are 11 different tracks, and that is looking at ways in which our infrastructure can be modernized so that we're both reliable and resilient. And I've expressed a number of concerns over the past 2 years I've been here that our ratepayers pay some of the highest, rates in the country, yet I'm not sure that we have enough to show for it. And let me rephrase and say, I know we don't have enough to show for it. So, the level of inertia that I've encountered in this role from the utilities, from other stakeholders, it's really baffling to me. And, chipping away at that one day at a time is a very draining proposition. So I welcome the attention from, elected officials and from stakeholders, because that level of attention, has a meaningful difference in our proceedings. So thank you for the question.
Marissa Gillett, again, is chairman of Connecticut's Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, also PURA. If you have a question for her, the number 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. And you can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Peter writes on Facebook that his wife has a small animal rescue in Torrington. Last month, she got a bill from Eversource for $59. The cost of electricity was about $7. The rest was delivery and other charges. And this is a question that we've heard time and time again from residents. Marissa, why are delivery charges so high?
How much time do you have? No, I'm just kidding. So we got this question, and I think, Lucy, we spoke about this in the fall. Yes. We had the twin, actually we had many tragedies and crises last year to deal with, but one of those was the, quote unquote, July 2020 rate increases. And that really brought some of this to the forefront. And as a result of that, we have directed our staff by September 30th of this year to present a redesign of the electric bill. And that is focused on, allowing folks to understand the cost drivers of their electricity better. I think right now what's confusing is there's just two categories on your bill, supply and delivery. But the delivery portion of your bill is really a misnomer. What's in there, it's been expanded to do is cover public policy costs, both from the state and the federal regulators. And that's being lumped in with the distribution charges. Truly what costs, the electric utilities money to deliver your electricity are the line items on your bill labeled distribution charge, or it's a fixed charge and a per kilowatt hour charge. The other charges that are lumped in on the delivery, those are for things like millstone, for taxes, for transmission. So if folks want to understand, what different line items on their bill are today, we have put together, narrated presentations that are on our website that walk you through each line item today and what goes into that line item. And what folks can look forward to is the redesign of the bill this fall. That will make, that more transparent. Now, again, none of those address lowering those rates, and we have some additional processes focused on that. Happy to talk through, but that concern persists. I hear that a lot, and we are first and foremost focused on, educating folks about those differences so they can be better informed on who they need to talk to. Is it PURA? Is it their elected officials? And in many cases, it's the latter. So happy to dig into any of that as you see fit, Lucy.
Well, I wanted to ask you, because we were talking about, how electricity is delivered, how it can be reliable and affordable. And I wanted you to chime in on how you see the role of ISO New England in all of this.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I spent most of my career in Maryland, which has a different grid operator called PJM. But ISO has exhibited some of the, same characteristics or concerns for me that we saw in PJM when I was in Maryland. And I think the first and foremost concern is that their market designs for something called capacity cause our ratepayers to pay twice for the same thing. You hear Commissioner Dykes talk about this a lot. My colleague over at the Connecticut DEEP, the Department of Energy Environmental Protection, the reason she's so focused on this, rightly so, is that Connecticut, like our New England partner states, have state policy goals for carbon reduction that are not being reflected in the markets that the ISO runs for the region. And as a result, our ratepayers end up having to pay twice. Once for what the state has deemed important, such as, retaining millstone, and another time for natural gas or even some oil units that the ISO markets are telling us that have to stay on. So, Commissioner Dykes has really, led some of the efforts to start conversations at the ISO on how to address this moving forward. I'm not suggesting that we need to strike out on our own. There are a lot of benefits from being in the regional grid. Most notably that what happened to Texas, couldn't repeat in New England to the same degree. I think there's a lot to unpack there, and Commissioner Dykes has a good handle on it.
Last cue for you, Marissa. We might be seeing a stormy summer and fall ahead, but when we think about the role of renewables and how this new technology will impact our grid, you think we'll be able to handle these upcoming storms?
Yeah, I think renewables, especially to the extent they can help us decentralize the grid. Connecticut's the fuel cell capital, right? And fuel cells, other types of energy storage, solar on the roof, that's what I mean when I say we need to focus on decentralizing the grid and empowering our ratepayers to have their own little, what are called nano grids. I think that there's some near-term actions that we ordered in our decision yesterday that are targeted at the emergency response plans for the utilities that should help customers have a better experience in the forthcoming storm season. But that is by no means the end of the conversation. There is still a lot of work to do. And the more that I can get the utilities to participate in good faith and cooperate in the proceedings before me, and less focused on appealing our orders and fines that I think have been rightfully imposed, the better we will all be.
Well, Marissa Gillett, we really thank you for the time you've given us today to talk about PURA's final decision. Anything that we missed that you want to sum up in less than 2 minutes?
We didn't touch that much on the management audits that have been ordered by yesterday's decision, but I think those kind of speak for themselves. We're ordering a third-party independent, contractor to come in and take, get embedded with our utilities and see firsthand what kind of changes to their organizational structures can be made. So that's another outcome from yesterday's proceeding. And then my closing message besides that would be just to thank the municipalities, elected officials, ratepayers for making your voice heard. It really made a difference in this proceeding. And I would encourage them to continue to engage going forward. Always happy to explain what's going on in the energy world. So thanks for having me.
Marissa, thank you. Marissa Gillett, Chairman of Connecticut's Public Utility Regulatory Authority, known as PURA. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Carmen Baskoff produced today's show. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. And tomorrow, it's almost the weekend. We want to hear about all the new hobbies you've picked up in the last year. We hope you join us for that conversation.